What would you do if you had been clipping grocery coupons for 20 years, skipping family milestones because you couldn't afford the plane ticket, quietly apologizing for your own needs? And then one night, you slipped your hand into your husband's jacket pocket and pulled out a check for $5 million. Would you scream? Would you wake him up and demand answers? Or would you fold that check back exactly as you found it, return the jacket to the couch, walk upstairs, and spend the rest of the night making a plan? Because that is what I did. And what happened next at 70 years old, with no financial history of my own and a marriage of 4 decades crumbling beneath my feet, that is the story I am going to tell you today. My name is Eleanor Harper. I am 71 years old. I live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors still wave from their porches, where everyone knows your name, and where nobody asks too many questions. For 40 years I planted marigolds along my front walkway every spring. I made pot roast on Sunday afternoons. I raised 2 daughters, Diane and Claire. And I loved a man named Robert Harper with the kind of patient, unquestioning steadiness that I once mistook for wisdom. Robert was a careful man. That was the word I used for him always. Careful. Careful with the thermostat. Careful with the grocery list. Careful with every single dollar that passed through our door. He always had been. From the very beginning of our marriage we had a clear arrangement. I ran the house, he managed the money. It felt natural. It felt sensible. After long enough it stopped feeling like an arrangement at all and started feeling simply like the shape of things. Like asking a surgeon to explain each stitch while he is still operating, you just trusted him to know what he was doing. We had been married 20 years when Robert first sat me down at the kitchen table, spread out a sheet of yellow legal paper covered in his small, precise handwriting, and told me we were in debt. Not catastrophically, he was careful to say. Just enough that we needed to be smart. He used that word often. Smart. As in, it wouldn't be smart to redo the living room right now. As in, it wouldn't be smart to fly out to Diane's baby shower. The timing was just too tight. As in, going back to work at my age would only create tax complications that would eat whatever I earned, so it simply wasn't worth it. I believed him. Of course I believed him. He was my husband. He handled the numbers. He always had. Perhaps that was the deepest trap of all. Not that he lied to me, but that I had slowly surrendered the right to question him. And somewhere along the way I had stopped even noticing that I had done it. So I clipped coupons. I bought the store brand cereal and the store brand everything. I told Claire I couldn't come to her gallery opening in Chicago because flights were simply too expensive, and I watched her voice go flat over the phone, and I felt the particular shame of a woman who cannot explain her own poverty because she doesn't entirely understand it herself. I missed my granddaughter's birth. Diane lived 3 states away and we couldn't justify the cost of the flight, so I sat at home while the first grandchild of my life came into the world without me there. Her name was Rosie. She was 3 years old now and called Robert Grandpa Rob with total adoration. Somehow there was always money for stuffed animals and ice cream. I had been carrying that particular fact, that particular quiet bruise, for 3 years before the night everything changed. The first signal that something was wrong had come about 3 years earlier, though I hadn't recognized it as a signal at the time. Robert started taking a different route home from his Thursday golf game. I only knew because our neighbor Patsy mentioned she hadn't seen his car on the usual street lately, and something small and cold moved through me, quick as a fish in a dark current, before I pushed it back down. He'd changed his route. So what? People change routes. The second signal came that winter. I found a restaurant receipt in his coat pocket while taking it to the dry cleaner. The place was called Renzo's, an Italian restaurant downtown where the pasta dishes ran $40 a plate. The receipt was for 2 people. Robert had told me he had worked late that Thursday. I stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper for a long, still moment. Then I put it back. He was treating a client, I told myself. That is simply what men like Robert do. The third signal I cannot excuse myself for ignoring. One morning last April, his phone buzzed on the nightstand while he was in the shower. The name on the screen was simply the letter C. 1 letter. Nothing else. I saw it. I looked away. I went downstairs and started breakfast and told myself that a single initial meant absolutely nothing. But something had shifted in me by then. Something quiet and geological, like the ground settling before anyone feels the tremor. I began paying attention in a different way. Not aggressively. Just attentively. I noticed that Robert always collected the mail before I could get to it. I noticed the new password on his laptop, something he had never bothered with before. I noticed that once a month he drove alone into the city, saying he had a meeting with the financial advisor, and he always came home in a better mood than he had been in all week. A lighter mood. The mood of a man who has been somewhere that pleases him. And then came the night in late October when everything I had been quietly accumulating finally had somewhere to go. Robert had fallen asleep in his armchair watching the evening news, the way he always did, chin dropping to his chest within 10 minutes of sitting down. It was a Wednesday. I was passing through the living room when I noticed his jacket thrown over the back of the couch. Not hung up. Just left there, which was unlike him. He was meticulous about those things. Something made me stop. I cannot explain it precisely. Call it instinct. Call it 20 years of accumulated unease finally reaching the surface. I reached into the inside breast pocket. My fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. I walked to the kitchen. I unfolded it under the overhead light. It was a cashier's check made out to Robert James Harper in the amount of $5,200,000, issued from a private investment firm in Columbus. I read that number 4 times. $5,200,000. From a company I had never heard of. Deposited or intended to be deposited into an account number I did not recognize. We were in debt, he had told me. For 20 years he had told me we were in debt. I listened to the sound of the television in the next room. I looked at the sleeping face of the man I had been married to for 40 years. Then I folded the check with great care, placed it back exactly as I had found it, returned the jacket to the couch, went upstairs, and lay down in the dark with my eyes wide open. I did not cry. I was far past crying. What I felt was something colder and far more useful than tears. I lay awake until 4 in the morning, and I made a list in my head. Not a grocery list. A list of everything I had given up. Diane's baby shower. I had not been there when my first grandchild came into the world because we could not afford the flight. Claire's gallery opening in Chicago. She had never entirely forgiven me, not because she was unkind, but because she couldn't understand and I couldn't explain. My own dental work 2 years ago. I had lived with a low, constant ache for 6 months rather than spend the money on a crown because Robert said the timing was difficult. My sister Vera's 70th birthday trip to Savannah, which 6 of us had planned together for over a year. I had canceled 3 weeks before, citing finances, and Vera had been gracious about it in a way that was somehow more painful than anger would have been. 20 years. 20 years of we can't afford it and maybe next year and you know how tight things are. 20 years of feeling quietly ashamed of our circumstances without ever quite understanding them, because I had trusted the man in the next room to tell me the truth about our own life. $5,200,000. If only she had known sooner. But sometimes the truth waits until you are ready to use it. The fear came, of course. It always does. Not all at once, but in waves, each one a little higher than the last. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation? What if I confronted him and he had some perfectly reasonable answer, and I had simply embarrassed myself and damaged our marriage over a misunderstanding? But I had held that check in my hands. I had read that account number. And I knew, the way you know things you have spent years refusing to let yourself know, that there was no reasonable explanation. A man does not hide $5 million from his wife because of an oversight. He hides it because he intends to keep it. The question was for what and for whom? I thought about the letter C on his phone. I thought about Renzo's. I thought about the monthly Columbus trips and the better moods and the password on the laptop. And I understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness that I was not only dealing with hidden money. I was dealing with a hidden life. By the time the sky began to go gray outside my window, I had made my decision. I was not going to confront Robert. Not yet. Not directly, not emotionally, not over the kitchen table with my voice shaking and him ready with his explanations. That was what he would expect. That was what a woman like me was supposed to do. Cry and ask and beg for the truth. I was not going to give him that advantage. I was going to be smart. His word. Smart. Here is what I decided that morning. First, I needed a copy of that check. Second, I needed to understand where that money had come from and where it was going. Third, I needed an attorney, not a family friend, not someone Robert knew, but a divorce attorney, a sharp one, before Robert had any idea I was even looking. And fourth, I needed to do all of this without changing a single thing about my daily behavior. Same pot roast on Sundays. Same marigolds. Same Eleanor. The plan felt enormous and terrifying in the gray dawn light. I was 70 years old. I had not managed my own finances in 4 decades. I did not know what a forensic accountant was, though I would learn soon enough. But I knew how to be patient. Lord knows I had been patient for 20 years. I got up at 6 as I always did. I started the coffee. When Robert came downstairs at 7, I smiled and handed him his mug and asked whether he wanted eggs. He said yes. Scrambled, same as always. I made them. And while I stood at that stove with my back to him, I was already planning every single step. Our church had a copy machine in the office. I volunteered there on Tuesday mornings, had for 15 years. 3 days away. I would have to wait, and waiting would be the hardest part. But I had learned something in 70 years of living. The women who win are rarely the ones who move fastest. They are the ones who move right. Tuesday morning I dressed carefully. My blue cardigan, my practical shoes, the small pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary, which I now wore with a feeling I couldn't entirely name. I told him I was going to help with the food pantry inventory, same as every week. He nodded from behind his coffee without looking up. He was already somewhere else in his mind. He often was, I understood now, recalibrating that fact. At the church I asked Patsy, who runs the office and has the discretion of a stone wall, if I could use the copier for something personal. She said of course and stepped out. My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved the check from the jacket pocket. I placed it face down on the glass and pressed the green button. 2 copies. I folded one and placed it in the inside zipper pocket of my purse, a pocket I had never once used in 20 years of carrying that bag. I returned the original to the jacket. Then I sat in the church parking lot and breathed. I had already written the name down the night before, searching on my tablet with the privacy mode turned on. A family law attorney in Columbus with 17 years of experience and a review that said simply, "She doesn't miss anything." That was precisely what I needed. Someone who didn't miss anything. I called from my cell phone, parked 2 streets from home, in front of the public library. The appointment was set for Thursday afternoon. I said my name was Eleanor. I said it was a consultation about a possible divorce. The word sat in my mouth like something foreign. Divorce. I was 70 years old. We had been married 40 years. The word felt both enormous and strangely like the first honest thing I had said aloud in months. Thursday, I told Robert the first was meeting my friend Helen for lunch in the city, and might do a little shopping afterward. He barely registered this. He had his own Thursday plans which I now understood completely. The attorney's name was Margaret Odom. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, clean, spare, serious. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible story and remains utterly unshockable. I liked her immediately. I placed the copy of the check on her desk. She studied it. Then she looked at me over her glasses. "How long have you been aware of this account?" 10 days, I said. I found the original check in his jacket. She nodded. Under Ohio's equitable distribution law, she explained, marital assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name was on them, were subject to division. She recommended a forensic accountant named David Kwan who specialized in hidden assets. We would gather first. Then we would file. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Agency. The particular sensation of moving through my own life, rather than simply being carried along by it. But something had shifted at home during my absence. Robert was in the kitchen when I came through the door. He had made himself a sandwich, which he almost never did when I was available. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. "How was Helen?" he asked. "Fine," I said, hanging up my coat. "We had soup at that French place on Broad." "She called here," he said, "about 20 minutes ago on the house phone. The air went very still. Your cell went to voicemail. I had forgotten to charge it in the car. It had died somewhere on the highway. She probably just wanted to chat more," I said evenly. "You know how she is. I'll call her back." Robert said nothing for a moment. He bit into his sandwich. "You seem tired." "Long drive," I said. And I went upstairs to change my clothes, my heart beating in a way I could feel behind my eyes. He hadn't pushed further. But I knew something had registered. Robert was a careful man. He would begin watching more carefully now. That evening, while he was in the garage, I went to his desk, something I had never done. The middle drawer was unlocked. Tucked beneath a car insurance renewal was a personal bank statement. Not from our joint account. From something called a Premier Private Account at a bank in Columbus. The most recent balance was $4,800,000. My hand did not shake this time. I photographed every page, texted them to an email address I had created that week under a name Robert didn't know, then deleted the texts and cleared the sent folder. Then I put the statement back exactly as I had found it, went to the kitchen and started dinner. I had my proof. The picture that emerged over the following weeks was detailed and damning. Robert had been quietly accumulating a separate investment portfolio for 11 years. It had started as modest transfers, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, the kind of sums that disappear easily in the noise of household finances. But compounding had done its work, and what had begun as careful, patient skimming had grown, according to David Kwan's forensic analysis, into just over $6 million spread across 3 linked accounts. $6 million. While I had been clipping coupons, while I had been missing my granddaughter's birth, while I had been apologizing for existing, Margaret filed for divorce on a Monday morning in November. Robert was served at home by a process server that afternoon. I was not there. I was sitting in Patsy's kitchen 2 miles away, drinking tea and watching the clock. My phone buzzed at 3:47. It was Robert. I let it ring. Then again. Then a text. "Eleanor, call me now." I finished my tea. I thanked Patsy, who asked no questions and squeezed my hand at the door. Then I drove home. Robert was standing in the living room with the divorce papers in his hand. He looked. I searched for the right word later. Caught. Not angry first. Caught first. The anger came a few seconds behind, like thunder following lightning. "What is this?" he said, though he knew perfectly well. "You've been served," I said. "Margaret Odom is my attorney. All communication goes through her from now on." He stared at me. 40 years, Eleanor." "Yes," I said. 40 years. His voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous. "Where did you get the idea I was hiding anything? Someone's been filling your head with nonsense. Is it Diane? Is it Claire? Because I promise you there are explanations for everything you think you found. Then you can give those explanations to the court," I said. I went upstairs. I locked the bedroom door, which I had never done in 40 years of marriage. The next 3 days were difficult. Robert did not rage. He was too strategic for that. Instead, he deployed a campaign of quiet pressure. Wounded silences. Pointed comments about what a divorce would do to this family. He called Diane, who called me crying, saying Dad sounded devastated and was I absolutely sure about this. He called Claire, who was more measured but still worried. He was constructing the narrative that I was the one causing damage, the one breaking something precious out of paranoia or confusion. And he was very good at it. He had been practicing that particular story for 20 years. And then Carolyn appeared. On the 4th day after he had been served, Robert left the house in the afternoon and came back at 7 with a woman I had never met. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the careful grooming of someone who has worked very hard to look effortless. She sat down in my living room as though she had been there before. Perhaps she had. On the Thursdays when I was at church, Robert said her name with a maddening composure. "This is Carolyn Marsh. She's my financial partner. She has information about the accounts that will clarify everything if you'll just listen." Carolyn Marsh. See, there it was. She began speaking in a smooth, practiced way about investment structures and tax shelters, and how the accounts had been set up to protect both of us. How nothing had been hidden with ill intent. How she and Robert had simply been building a secure financial future that required a certain kind of privacy during the structuring phase. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "You're his girlfriend." Silence. I am not going to sit here and listen to an explanation from the woman my husband has been seeing on Thursday evenings. If your name appears on any of the accounts in question, my attorney will be in touch with you directly. I would like you both to leave now. Robert's composure cracked. He told me I was making an enormous mistake. He told me I didn't understand what I was throwing away. His voice rose in a way I hadn't heard in years, And Carolyn put her hand on his arm, a quick reflex of a gesture. And somehow that one small proprietary touch told me everything I needed to know about the duration and the nature of what they had built together on the foundation of my coupon clipping and my canceled flights and my years of quiet, patient apology. I opened the front door. "Good night," I said. They left. I closed the door, leaned against it, and pressed my hands flat against the wood and breathed. My legs were trembling slightly. My heart was loud in my ears. But I had held. I had not cried, not pleaded, not given an inch. I picked up my phone and called Margaret to report the visit. She said I had handled it correctly and to document everything. Then I called Diane. "I need a few days," I told her. "I need to come stay with you. I need to breathe." She said yes without hesitation, and for 4 days I sat in her backyard with little Rosie climbing into my lap, showing me drawings of cats, pressing her warm weight against my chest. I let that be enough. I came home rested and harder in a way that felt necessary. The settlement offer arrived by letter through Robert's attorney, a man named Gerald Hatch, whose firm was polished and clearly accustomed to making problems disappear quietly. The substance was simple. Robert would offer me the house outright, plus a lump sum of $350,000, plus monthly spousal support of $4,000 for 10 years. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and did a very simple calculation. $350,000 plus 10 years of support came to roughly $800,000 total. He was offering me $800,000 to go away quietly and leave him with $6 million. I took the letter to Margaret. She read it and said with characteristic understatement, "He's hoping you don't understand what you're actually entitled to." I rejected the offer the same afternoon. Robert's response 3 days later was personal rather than legal. He came to the house and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in the careful way he had always had, and he told me he had made mistakes. He told me that Carolyn meant nothing, that she was a business relationship that had become complicated. He told me that everything he had built had been for us, for our future, for security in our old age, and that he had planned to tell me once the accounts were fully structured. He told me he missed me. And then he looked at me with the eyes of a man I had loved for 40 years and said, "Ellie, we're old. Do we really want to spend whatever time we have left fighting over this?" It was well done. I will give him that. A younger version of me, the version who had believed him about the debt, who had cancelled Claire's gallery opening, who had missed Rosie's birth, that version might have wavered. I poured myself more coffee. "Ronald," I said, "you hid $6 million from me for 11 years. You built a life with another woman. You let me live in manufactured poverty, while you invested our marital money under your name alone. And now you want me to call it a mistake." He said nothing. "I don't believe you plan to tell me anything," I said. "I believe you plan to leave. I think the accounts were preparation." He left without another word. That was the moment she stopped being the woman who waited, and became the woman who moved. The preliminary hearing was set for the second week of January. I had never been inside a courtroom as a participant before. I expected it to feel enormous and frightening. It was a mid-sized room with fluorescent lighting and the faint smell of old paper. A place where truths are finally required to sit still and be examined. I wore my navy dress and the pearl earrings. Diane sat behind me in the gallery. Claire had driven up from Cincinnati and sat beside her. Knowing they were there, just behind my left shoulder, was something I carried into that room like a hand pressed gently against my back. Margaret stood beside me at the plaintiff's table with the stillness of someone who had no doubt whatsoever about the quality of her preparation. Robert sat at the opposite table in a dark suit that had cost more than my car. He did not look at me when I walked in. He was performing the composure of an innocent man, the way he had been performing things for years. Carolyn sat just behind him. Her name had appeared in David Kwan's forensic report as a co-signatory on one of the investment accounts. David Kwan testified for 40 minutes, walking the court through the 11-year history of the accounts, the initial transfers, the compounding returns, the use of the investment firm as an intermediary to obscure the money's marital origins. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses, wrote steadily on a small notepad throughout. Then Gerald Hatch offered Robert's counter-narrative. The money, Robert claimed, had been seeded by an inheritance from his uncle Frank, who had passed away 14 years ago, which under Ohio law could potentially qualify as separate property rather than a marital asset. It was a prepared argument. It was carefully constructed. It almost might have worked. Margaret asked Gerald to confirm the date of Frank's death and the estate distribution. Gerald confirmed. Frank had died 14 years ago. Estate distributed 12.5 years ago. Then Margaret produced a certified record from the investment firm showing the date of the very first transfer into Robert's private account. It was dated 9 years ago, nearly 4 years after the inheritance had been fully distributed. The silence in the room had a texture to it. Margaret then produced the subpoenaed account records from those inheritance years. The inherited funds had been deposited, drawn down to zero within 14 months, and spent entirely. The balance at the end of that period was $41. The seed money for the private portfolio could not have come from Uncle Frank. Robert turned to Gerald and said something low and urgent. Gerald put his hand on Robert's arm, and it struck me with some dark, distant humor that Robert was suddenly surrounded by people physically restraining him from his own impulses. Carolyn had gone very still. Margaret asked pleasantly whether Mr. Hatch would like to offer an amended explanation for the source of the initial investment capital. Gerald asked for a brief recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During that recess, I sat in my chair and felt not triumph exactly, but the particular sensation of something that has been tilted for a very long time finally becoming level. The settlement negotiation happened in a small conference room down the hall. I sat beside Margaret. Robert sat across from me, for the first time not at my kitchen table, but in a neutral room where neither of us had any history. He looked tired. Not performed exhaustion. Genuinely tired, in the way of a person whose story has simply stopped working. Carolyn was not in the room. Someone had wisely advised her to wait in the hallway. Gerald opened with a revised offer. 50% of the documented accounts, roughly $3,100,000, plus the house plus revised spousal support. Margaret said that was closer, but we needed to discuss the third account, a smaller one of approximately $400,000 that David's report had identified and which Robert had not yet formally disclosed. Robert looked at Gerald with the expression of a man who has stepped on a nail he laid himself. After Gerald confirmed the forensic basis, there was a long pause. All 3 accounts, Margaret said pleasantly, plus the house, plus spousal support, and 1 provision. She placed a single sheet on the table. Mrs. Harper will be held harmless from any tax liability related to the accounts in question. Any back taxes or penalties associated with the structuring of these accounts are Mr. Harper's sole responsibility. That was the detail with the most visible effect. Robert's jaw tightened. They negotiated for 50 minutes. The final terms, the family home free and clear. $3,400,000 from the combined accounts, transferred within 30 days. Spousal support of $6,500 per month for 12 years, reflecting my lost earning years. And the tax provision exactly as written. Robert would retain approximately $2,700,000 in remaining assets, minus Gerald Hatch's considerable fees, minus taxes, minus penalties. Not nothing. But not the quiet, clean exit he had planned. Not the version of this story where Eleanor Harper accepted $800,000 and went away grateful. He signed the final settlement agreement on a Thursday afternoon in late February. Margaret called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I was sitting in my kitchen. The marigold beds were still bare outside the window, too early for planting. But I had already been thinking about what I would put in this spring. Something different. Something I had always wanted and never once allowed myself to choose. I had expected to feel something enormous, relief, vindication, grief, all of it rushing in at once. What I felt was quieter than that. It felt like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. My sister Vera came in from the garden and looked at my face. "Done," she said. "Done," I said. She sat across from me and put her hand over mine, and we sat there without speaking, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Carolyn Marsh had quietly vanished from my narrative by then. Whatever she had imagined for herself, whatever informal understanding had been built across those years of Thursday evenings, had not survived contact with a forensic report and a courtroom. The account she had co-signed, expecting to benefit from one day, had been substantially consumed by the settlement and the tax proceedings. What remained belonged to Robert. The years she had invested in that particular future had not produced the return she had planned for. There is something almost geometric about that, when I allow myself to look at it clearly. Robert left Millbrook 18 months after the divorce was final. I heard he had gone to Columbus. I wished him no particular harm. I felt no particular sorrow. The tax penalties from the improperly structured accounts landed with the force of a delayed reckoning. David Kwan's forensic report had been thorough, and certain institutions do not negotiate the way attorneys do. By the following summer, Robert was contesting a penalty assessment that his remaining assets could barely cover. The legal fees compounded. The life he had planned, the quiet, comfortable, carefully constructed life built on 20 years of my believing his fiction, had not arrived on the schedule he had designed. What you set in motion tends to continue in motion. Spring came early that year and I planted something I had wanted for 15 years, a proper cutting garden. Dahlias, sweet peas, zinnias in 6 different colors, cosmos that grew so tall by August they nodded over the fence into the sidewalk. The neighbors stopped to look at it. Patsy said it was the most beautiful front yard on the street, and I accepted the compliment without the strange, guilty deflection I had spent decades practicing. The house was mine now, fully legally in my name alone. I had the deed framed in a simple black frame and hung it in the hallway where the family portrait used to be. Diane thought this was perhaps slightly aggressive. Claire thought it was perfect. I went to Savannah in April. Vera and I and 4 other women, all of us in our late 60s and 70s, all of us with our own histories of accommodation and endurance, rented a house on a cobblestone street for 10 days. We ate shrimp and walked through squares draped in Spanish moss and stayed up too late talking about things we had wanted and never allowed ourselves. It was the best trip of my life. I cried on the last day, the good kind, the kind that comes from realizing you are happy. Actually happy in a way that is solid and earned and entirely yours. Little Rosie, now 4, had become my particular joy. I flew to Columbus regularly. The flights were, it turned out, entirely affordable. We went to the Children's Museum and made cookies and read every book on her shelf, and she fell asleep against my arm during movies with the total, uncomplicated trust of a small person who knows she is completely safe. I miss no more birthdays. I miss no more of the ordinary days that turn out to be the ones you remember. I started painting again, watercolors, nothing remarkable, just mine. The instructor said I had a good eye for light. I thought about that for days. I joined with full intention the Thursday evening support group for women at the community center. No longer as someone in crisis, but as someone 2 years out from it with a story that might be useful to others. A retired teacher named Gloria had become one of my closest friends. We took walks on Saturday mornings and talked about our gardens and our children and occasionally, briefly, our husbands, past, present, and absent, with the equanimity of women who have come through something real. On an August evening, I sat in my cutting garden with Vera. The cosmos were swaying at the fence. The dahlias were enormous and slightly absurd and completely wonderful. And I thought about the woman who had stood in her kitchen in her slippers and her old cardigan, holding a check she was never supposed to find. She had been frightened. She had been 70 years old with no financial independence and no plan and a marriage of 4 decades dissolving beneath her. She had done it anyway. One step at a time, one quiet decision at a time, she had done it. They say the best time to plant a garden is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I spent 40 years trusting a man who trusted me not to look too closely. The moment I looked, everything changed. I was 70 years old with no financial history of my own. I found a lawyer. I found the evidence. I found a version of myself I had not seen in decades. If this story stayed with you, if it reached something in you that needed reaching, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. Tell me what you would have done with that check. Subscribe if you are new here, because there are more stories like this one coming. And take care of yourself, because you have always been worth taking care of.